Picture this. It's the bitter winter of 1939. Snow lies thick across Finland's forests. The lakes are frozen solid, and the nights are long and dark. On one side stands the Soviet Union, the largest country in the world, armed with tanks, bombers, and over 1 million soldiers. On the other side is Finland, a young nation, small in population, poorly armed, and largely unknown on the world stage. On paper, this was never supposed to be a contest. The Soviet Union expected a quick victory. Its leaders imagined rolling their tanks across Finland within a few weeks, raising their red flag over Helsinki, and swallowing up their tiny neighbor. But that's not what happened. Instead, the world watched in disbelief as Finland, outnumbered and outgunned, held off the Soviet giant for months. The Finns fought with grit, clever tactics, and something the world came to admire: an unshakable national spirit known as sisu. The story of why the Soviet Union couldn't break Finland isn't just about war. It's about resilience, courage, and the will of ordinary people to protect their home. And it's a reminder, even for us today, that strength doesn't always come from numbers or weapons. Sometimes it comes from the heart. Now, let's begin. To really understand why the Soviet Union failed to crush Finland, we need to take a step back and look at Finland itself. For centuries, Finland was not an independent country. It was caught between two powerful neighbors, Sweden to the west and Russia to the east. In fact, Finland spent over 600 years as part of the Swedish kingdom, and later over 100 years under Russian control. By the time Finland declared independence in 1917, it was still finding its identity as a nation. Now, independence sounds exciting, but for Finland, it came with challenges. The country was poor, its population was small, just over 3.5 million people, and it lacked modern industry compared to bigger European nations. Politically, Finland was also divided. Just after independence, it suffered a brutal civil war between left-wing groups inspired by the Russian Revolution and conservatives who wanted a more traditional society. But despite these struggles, something important was happening. Finns were building a sense of unity, forged from centuries of survival in harsh northern landscapes. Life in Finland was tough: long winters, short growing seasons, and isolation from the rest of Europe. People relied on each other, developed resilience, and valued independence deeply. This culture of survival would soon be tested. By the late 1930s, Finland had a democratic government, but it also knew that living next to the Soviet Union was dangerous. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, looked at Finland not as a neighbor, but as a security threat. He worried that if another great power, like Nazi Germany, used Finland's territory, it could threaten Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities, just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. So, in Stalin's eyes, Finland needed to be controlled, one way or another. But here's the thing. While Finland may have been small, it was fiercely proud of its independence. It had only been free for 2 decades, and the thought of giving up that freedom, especially after so many centuries under foreign rule, was unbearable. This spirit of resistance, deeply rooted in Finnish culture, would soon make history. When war loomed in late 1939, the scale of imbalance between the Soviet Union and Finland was staggering. The Soviet Union was one of the world's military superpowers. It had a standing army of millions, thousands of tanks, modern aircraft, and endless reserves of men and resources. Stalin believed that Finland, a country with fewer people than New York City at the time, wouldn't last more than a few days once the Red Army marched in. Finland's army told a very different story. It had fewer than 350,000 soldiers, and many of them were reservists, ordinary farmers, lumberjacks, and students who traded their tools for rifles. Finland had only a handful of tanks, very little artillery, and barely an air force. On top of that, much of their equipment was outdated, and supplies were limited. The numbers looked hopeless. One Soviet general even joked that his men could defeat Finland by just spitting. But numbers don't tell the whole story. What Finland lacked in equipment, it made up for in preparation, ingenuity, and terrain. Its army knew the forests and frozen lakes better than anyone. Most Finnish soldiers had grown up skiing, hunting, and living outdoors in brutal winters. They were used to the cold in ways Soviet troops were not. More importantly, the Finns weren't fighting to conquer. They were fighting for survival. For them, this wasn't just another border war. It was about defending their homes, their families, and their very right to exist as a free nation. That kind of motivation gave Finland an invisible strength that no numbers chart could measure. The stage was set. The mighty Soviet bear against the stubborn Finnish fox. And when the first shots were fired, the world would see that David wasn't going down without a fight. Now let's step onto the frozen battlefield and see how it all began. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet planes roared over Helsinki, dropping bombs on Finland's capital. It was the official start of what came to be known as the Winter War. The Soviets sent 500,000 troops into Finland, expecting an easy march to victory. But almost immediately, things went wrong for them. First, the winter was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures dropped as low as 40 degrees Celsius. That's about 40 Fahrenheit too. Soviet troops, many from warmer parts of the USSR, were poorly clothed for the cold. Their boots froze to the ground, their weapons jammed, and frostbite spread rapidly. Meanwhile, the Finns blended perfectly into the landscape. Wearing white camouflage over their winter coats, they skied silently through the forests, striking Soviet columns and vanishing into the snow. The Soviets, stuck on roads and relying on heavy vehicles, couldn't keep up. One of the most famous Finnish strategies was the motti tactic. A motti is a pile of firewood, and the name fit perfectly. Finnish troops would split large Soviet forces into smaller isolated groups, just like cutting logs into pieces. Once divided, those groups became easier to surround and destroy. The Finns also used what they had with deadly creativity. Take the Molotov cocktail, for example. Named sarcastically after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, it was nothing more than a glass bottle filled with gasoline and a rag for a fuse. But against Soviet tanks, it was devastating. Soldiers would run up close, toss the burning bottle onto a tank's engine vents, and watch it burst into flames. It was a cheap, simple weapon that gave ordinary Finns a way to fight armored giants. The world looked on in amazement. How could a small country with barely any modern weapons be humiliating one of the largest armies in the world? Newspapers across Europe and America wrote glowing stories about the white death of Finland's forests and the courage of its soldiers. But for the Finns themselves, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival. They knew they couldn't win a long war against the Soviet Union. Their hope was to hold out just long enough that Stalin would decide it wasn't worth the cost. And as the weeks dragged on, the cost for the Soviets kept climbing higher than they ever imagined. If you truly want to understand why Finland couldn't be broken, you need to first understand the word sisu. Now, sisu is one of those words that doesn't translate neatly into English. It's not just courage, it's not just stubbornness. It's a mix of resilience, grit, and the sheer determination to keep going, even when the odds are impossible. It's the refusal to quit, no matter how cold, hungry, or outnumbered you are. For centuries, living in Finland demanded sisu. Farmers survived on thin soil and short summers. Families endured long, dark winters where food was scarce. Hunters, lumberjacks, and fishermen often faced life and death struggles with nature itself. So by 1939, sisu was already a part of the national character. When the Soviet Union invaded, this cultural backbone became the Finns' greatest weapon. Soldiers often fought for days in freezing conditions with little food or rest, holding their positions even when they were cut off. Civilians too showed sisu, digging trenches, supporting the army, and enduring bombings without breaking morale. It's said that in those dark months of the Winter War, the Finnish people weren't just defending their borders. They were defending their way of life, their independence, and their identity. That spirit of sisu spread from the battlefield to every household, and it made Finland unshakable in ways the Soviets never understood. Let's take a closer look at how the Finns turned the frozen wilderness into their greatest weapon. The Red Army entered Finland expecting to use its size and strength to steamroll the defenders. But instead of open battlefields, they found themselves trapped in an icy nightmare. Here's where Finland's clever use of guerrilla tactics turned the war upside down. First, mobility. Finnish soldiers moved on skis, gliding silently across snow-covered forests while Soviet troops trudged along icy roads. A Soviet column might stretch for miles, tanks and trucks lined up bumper to bumper, vulnerable to ambush. The Finns would swoop in, attack the front and rear, then vanish before reinforcements could react. Second, camouflage. Dressed in white overcoats, Finnish ski troops blended into the snow. Soviet soldiers, wearing dark green uniforms, stood out like targets on a white canvas. This gave Finnish sharpshooters a deadly advantage. And that brings us to one of the most legendary figures of the war, the Simo Häyhä, also known as the White Death. Armed with just a rifle and iron sights, no fancy scope, he is credited with over 500 kills during the Winter War. The Soviets feared him so much they launched artillery strikes just to take out one man. Yet he survived, becoming a symbol of Finland's deadly efficiency. Third, creativity. When resources are limited, you invent solutions. The Molotov cocktail became the poster child for Finnish ingenuity. Cheap to make and easy to throw, it gave infantry a way to destroy the Soviet tanks that otherwise should have crushed them. Some Finnish soldiers even joked that if Stalin was sending Molotov bread baskets in the form of bombs, they'd return the favor with Molotov cocktails. These tactics turned Soviet strength into weakness. Big armies and heavy tanks couldn't maneuver in the forests. The very snow and trees became allies of Finland. Day after day, Soviet units froze, starved, or were picked off one group at a time. The Finns, light on their feet, struck and disappeared like ghosts. It was a masterclass in using home terrain to level the battlefield. Here's an interesting fact. Wars are often remembered not just for battles, but for the people who stood out in them. The Winter War was full of such figures, ordinary men and women who became legends. We've already mentioned Simo Häyhä, the White Death. He wasn't a professional soldier by training. He was a farmer and hunter who simply knew how to handle a rifle and survive in the woods. During the Winter War, he became the embodiment of Finnish resilience. With nothing but patience, skill, and sisu, he terrified Soviet troops to the point that they whispered his name like a ghost story. But Häyhä wasn't alone. Thousands of other Finnish sharpshooters, ski troops, and volunteers carried out acts of heroism that didn't make headlines but were just as important. Groups of skiers would travel for miles in freezing conditions, carrying supplies, scouting enemy positions, or ambushing Soviet convoys. These weren't elite special forces. They were young men, farmers, students, and woodsmen, simply fighting because their homeland needed them. And it wasn't just soldiers. Civilians also played their part. Families gave shelter to troops, women joined auxiliary services to cook, sew uniforms, or transport supplies, and communities worked together to keep morale alive. Imagine living in a small wooden house, bombed from the sky, freezing in sub-zero weather, yet still finding the strength to bake bread for soldiers passing through. That's the kind of quiet heroism that carried Finland through those months. Perhaps the most striking part of these stories is that they weren't driven by hatred. For many Finns, the war wasn't about destroying an enemy, it was about protecting their home. That clarity of purpose gave them a kind of calm strength that even overwhelming odds couldn't shake. While the Finns showed resilience and creativity, the Soviets struggled with problems of their own making. First, there was Stalin's paranoia. Before the war, Stalin had carried out massive purges of his military leadership. Many of the Soviet Union's most experienced generals had been executed or imprisoned. This left the Red Army led by officers who were inexperienced and often terrified of making mistakes, since mistakes could cost them their lives. Second, logistics. The Soviet Union's war machine was designed for vast open plains, not Finland's frozen forests. Tanks and trucks jammed narrow roads, while supply lines broke down in deep snow. Soldiers often went hungry, frostbitten, or without proper equipment. Third, morale. Soviet soldiers didn't have the same motivation as the Finns. Many of them didn't even know why they were fighting. To them, Finland was just another assignment ordered by distant leaders in Moscow. Facing deadly cold, endless ambushes, and invisible enemies, morale collapsed quickly. There were also strategic blunders. At first, the Soviets tried to attack everywhere at once, spreading their forces thin. This allowed Finnish troops to pick them off piece by piece. Soviet commanders underestimated the Finns, believing sheer numbers would guarantee victory. By the time they adjusted their tactics, the world had already witnessed their humiliating struggles. And then there was the international stage. Countries like Britain and France loudly praised Finland's courage, even though their direct help was limited. The embarrassment for the Soviet Union was enormous. Here was a global superpower struggling to defeat a nation that was supposed to be crushed in weeks. In the end, the Soviets did adapt, and their overwhelming numbers began to wear Finland down. But the damage was done. The myth of an unstoppable Red Army was shattered, and the Finns had shown the world what courage and determination could do. But how did it happen? How was Finland able to survive all this? Here are the turning points that changed everything. By early 1940, the Winter War had dragged on far longer than Stalin ever expected. The Soviets had thrown hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and heavy artillery into Finland. Yet the tiny nation still stood. How did Finland manage it? The answer lies in a combination of factors, both Finnish strengths and Soviet weaknesses. First, the Finns made every bullet count. With so few weapons and supplies, they couldn't afford waste. Soldiers learned to conserve ammunition, scavenge what they could from the battlefield, and use homemade weapons like Molotov cocktails to even the odds. Second, the terrain was Finland's greatest ally. The forests and frozen lakes neutralized Soviet advantages in tanks and numbers. Big armored divisions meant little when they were funneled onto narrow roads where Finnish ambushes waited. Third, the Finns had prepared, even if modestly. They built defensive lines, most famously the Mannerheim Line, named after their commander, Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. Though not heavily fortified by European standards, it used Finland's natural geography, lakes, forests, and rocky hills, to slow down Soviet advances. But perhaps the biggest factor was morale. Finnish soldiers were fighting for survival. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were often poorly motivated and confused about why they were freezing and dying in a land that wasn't their home. None of this meant Finland could win outright. By February 1940, the Soviets had regrouped, brought in fresh troops, and started learning from their mistakes. Their artillery bombardments grew heavier, and their assaults more coordinated. Finland, exhausted and running out of supplies, began to bend. Yet the key turning point was not on the battlefield, it was in politics. Stalin realized that crushing Finland was costing him too much. Internationally, the Soviet Union was being mocked, and at home, the war was straining resources he needed for bigger plans in Europe. Finland, through sheer resilience, had forced the world's largest army to rethink its strategy. That alone was a victory in spirit. By March 1940, Finland faced a hard reality. They had fought bravely, but their ammunition and supplies were nearly gone. Their soldiers were exhausted, and cities were suffering under relentless Soviet bombardment. They could not fight forever. On March 13, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. The terms were harsh. Finland had to give up about 11% of its territory, including Guerilla, forcing over 400,000 Finns to leave their homes and resettle elsewhere in the country. It was a painful sacrifice for a nation that had defended its independence so fiercely. But here's the remarkable part. Finland remained independent. Unlike the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were fully absorbed into the Soviet Union, Finland kept its sovereignty. That was the ultimate prize. The Soviets had wanted total control, but Finland had denied them. The cost was enormous: 25,000 Finnish soldiers killed and many more wounded. But Soviet losses were staggering in comparison. Estimates range from 120,000 deaths to over 300,000 dead, plus tens of thousands wounded or captured. The world took notice. The Winter War revealed that the Red Army was far less effective than anyone had believed. This lesson did not go unnoticed by Adolf Hitler, who saw Soviet weakness as encouragement for his own invasion plans later in World War II. For Finland, though, the war left scars, but also pride. They had proven themselves unbreakable. Against all odds, a small nation had stared down a giant and survived. Their independence, though bruised, was intact. And that survival shaped Finland's path for decades to come. It became part of their national identity, a story every Finn could point to as proof that their country, no matter how small, would never bow easily to outside power. With that said, let's now turn to what came after, the aftermath and the lasting legacy it left behind. The Winter War ended in March 1940, but its impact lasted far longer than those 3 months of fighting. For Finland, the outcome was bittersweet. On one hand, they had to hand over huge swaths of land to the Soviet Union, including Guerilla, territory filled with farms, villages, and memories. Entire families had to abandon homes where their ancestors had lived for centuries. It was a wound that cut deep into the nation's heart. On the other hand, Finland had achieved something astonishing: survival. Unlike so many small countries in Europe during that era, Finland had resisted being swallowed whole by a much larger power. Independence remained intact. For a people who had only been free since 1917, this was priceless. The war also transformed Finland's reputation. Before 1939, most of the world barely noticed the country. Afterwards, Finland became a symbol of courage and resilience. Newspapers across Europe and America praised the tiny nation that stood up to the Soviet giant. Military leaders around the world studied Finland's tactics, especially how they used terrain and mobility to turn disadvantages into strengths. For the Soviet Union, the Winter War was an embarrassment. Though they technically won by seizing territory, their staggering losses revealed major weaknesses in their military. Stalin had gone into the war expecting a quick victory, only to be dragged through months of humiliation. These failures sent ripples through global politics. Hitler, watching from Germany, concluded that the Red Army wasn't as strong as it looked, a belief that influenced his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. For Finland, the Winter War wasn't the end of conflict with the Soviets. Just over a year later, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Finland saw an opportunity to reclaim its lost lands and entered what became known as the Continuation War. But that's another chapter in Finland's long struggle with its giant neighbour. The real legacy of the Winter War wasn't just in borders or treaties, it was in national character. It proved that Finland's independence wasn't an accident. It was earned through sacrifice, courage, and unity. So what does the Winter War teach us, beyond the facts and figures? Quite a lot, actually. Number 1. Strength isn't just about numbers. The Soviet Union had overwhelming superiority on paper. Tanks, planes, soldiers by the millions. Yet Finland, with a fraction of that power, managed to hold its ground. This is a reminder that wars are not won by statistics alone. Motivation, terrain, and clever strategy can tip the balance. Number 2, never underestimate the will to defend home. For Soviet soldiers, Finland was a cold, strange place they didn't care about. For Finns, every inch of snow-covered ground was home. That difference in motivation gave the smaller side an advantage no general could calculate. Number 3, leadership matters. The Soviet purges of the 1930s had left the Red Army without its best commanders. In contrast, Finland had Mannerheim, a respected strategic leader who inspired confidence. Wars are shaped not just by equipment, but by the people making decisions. Number 4. Unity in hardship builds resilience. The Winter War united Finland in a way few events could. Civilians and soldiers alike shared the burden, creating a spirit of togetherness. That kind of unity, born in suffering, can sustain a nation long after the battle ends. Number 5. Small nations can shape big history. The world didn't expect Finland to matter much in 1939. Yet their resistance shook global confidence in the Soviet Union, influenced Hitler's calculations, and earned admiration worldwide. It shows that even small countries can alter the course of history when they refuse to give up. For today's generations, especially those who didn't live through World War II, the Winter War stands as a reminder that resilience, courage, and determination are timeless values. Technology changes, borders shift, but the spirit of standing firm against overwhelming odds is something we can all learn from. In conclusion, the Winter War remains one of history's most powerful reminders that true strength doesn't always come from size or numbers. On paper, Finland should have been crushed in days. Instead, it fought for months, forcing the mighty Soviet Union to pay dearly for every inch of frozen ground. Yes, Finland lost land. Yes, thousands of lives were sacrificed. But what mattered most is that Finland kept its independence. That survival was born from courage, ingenuity, and the spirit of sisu, the determination to keep going when the world expects you to fall. Even today, this story speaks to us. It reminds us that resilience, unity, and heart can stand firm against overwhelming odds. And that's why Finland could not be broken, not by bombs, not by tanks, not even by the cold hand of history itself. But here's a thought I'll leave with you. If you were in Finland's position, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a giant, would you have stood your ground or looked for another path? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this story as powerful as I did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more untold history, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage and resilience. Because in the end, history isn't just about the past. It's about the lessons we carry with us today. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.